Big changes are coming in 2026 for sleep apnea. Today, I'm going to be talking about the current rating criteria for sleep apnea, the proposed rating criteria changes for sleep apnea. How does the proposed changes affect your claim and secondary service connection for sleep apnea? Sleep apnea is one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions amongst veterans, but it is oftentimes one of the hardest to get service connected, especially on a direct basis. But if successful, the current disability schedule is a lot more generous than the proposed changes that are coming sometime in the summer of 2026. So if you have or suspect that you have sleep apnea and you believe it to be linked to your military service, you need to take a step forward now before the changes do come into effect. The VA rates sleep apnea under the 38 CFR 4.97 under Diagnostic Code 6847. And under the current rules, the following percentages with symptoms are as follows. Now keep in mind, before I get into this, a sleep study is required and will uncover most likely which of the following that you will fall within. Under the current criteria, there is a 0% rating if the diagnosis documented asymptomatic. You get a 30% rating if you have persistent daytime sleepiness or hypersomnolence. I think that's how you pronounce that. You get a 50% rating currently if you require a CPAP or a similar breathing assisted device. And you currently get a 100% rating if you have chronic respiratory failure, cor pulmonale, I think that's how you pronounce that, or tracheostomy. The most common current rating today is a 50% rating because you get a 50% rating by simply having to use a CPAP machine. Now, the VA has published a notice of proposed rulemaking to update the rating schedule, including for sleep apnea, revising Diagnostic Code 6847, and have made public comments that it will most likely go into effect in the summer of 2026. If it is finalized, the new system rating criteria would adjust and change, and here's how that would look. You would get a 0% rating for asymptomatic with or without treatment. You would qualify for a 10% rating for sleep apnea for persistent symptoms despite whatever treatment that you're on. Or you would get a 50% rating for ineffective or intolerable treatment. For example, the CPAP does not work or you cannot tolerate the CPAP. And it's my opinion that most likely to get the 50% is going to require that you go through an additional sleep study, or the sleep study itself would have to indicate whether the treatment was tolerable or not. And you'd be eligible for a 100% rating with ineffective treatment with end organ damage. So after the proposed changes would go into effect, there would be no automatic 50% rating for CPAP use, and the 30% rating that's currently available will most likely be removed from the schedule. So as you can see, it's most likely going to be in your best interest to be rated under the current rating criteria versus the proposed changes that's going to come sometime in 2026, most likely the summer. So that's why it's important that you act now and at least get your intent to file put in so that you can get your claim condition fully submitted within the 1-year mark to have the opportunity to be rated under the most favorable schedule for you. So like I said, there is no exact date yet, but it is expected for the summertime of 2026 once finalized and after a 60-day effective period. So what does this mean for your claim? If you've already been granted sleep apnea service connection, your rating is grandfathered under the current rules and you should be safe. If your claim is pending but not decided when the final rule goes into effect, most experts say that it will be evaluated under the old criteria if filed before the effective date of the proposed changes, which will most likely be to your advantage. But if you file after the changes take effect, the new criteria will apply, which could make it harder to get a 50% service connection without evidence of treatment failure, which will be most likely backed up and required to be backed up by a sleep study indicating from an observable perspective that you cannot tolerate a CPAP. And like I said, that is my speculation, but that's still to be determined. So the bottom line, and I'm going to repeat myself, if you believe you have sleep apnea or you've been diagnosed with sleep apnea and you believe that it is connected to your time in the service, filing now under the current rating schedule may be more favorable for you and other veterans. Now let's discuss sleep apnea as a secondary condition to another direct service-connected condition. Sleep apnea can be claimed secondary to other service-connected conditions if medical evidence ties your sleep apnea to them. And in many cases, the secondary route will be the viable, credible link to service connection. And some common conditions that veterans successfully claim sleep apnea secondary to include PTSD, which is linked to sleep disturbances and weight changes, rhinitis and sinusitis, which are airway obstruction issues and are, by the way, a presumptive condition under the PACT Act. And a presumptive condition, which I'll cover in a separate video, but a presumptive condition is a condition that the VA concedes is service-connected simply by the dates that you were in service and the location where you served at, which are spelled out within the PACT Act. Another condition that sleep apnea is often secondary to is obesity or hypertension, which are linked to medication or health effects of service. And it's worth noting that these conditions can also be created and secondary to another direct condition. For example, PTSD is linked to sleep disturbances and weight changes, okay? If you go on medication for PTSD, that can lead to obesity and hypertension, which in turn can link to sleep apnea. So in a condition like that, you would have sleep apnea, which would be secondary to obesity and hypertension, which is then secondary to PTSD. You can have secondaries tied to secondaries tied to secondaries that are all linked to one primary service-connected condition. Another commonly direct connected condition or secondary condition that sleep apnea is linked to is traumatic brain injury, or what's referred to as a TBI. Now, there's also other conditions sleep apnea can be tied to. So I recommend that you would look at all your direct connected conditions or all your primary diagnosis that potentially could be either service connected or already are service connected. Research those conditions to see is sleep apnea a possible secondary condition to one of those. If it is, and it's already widely accepted to be a secondary condition, that would be definitely the path of least resistance and most likely the best path for you to take on your claim. But as always, seek the proper advice from a qualified VSO, your attorney, or whoever else is representing you in the process. So now let's discuss what type of evidence is needed for a successful sleep apnea service-connected outcome. The first thing you're going to need is a recent sleep study. You're going to need your medical records that are going to be showing a diagnosis and the severity of your particular sleep apnea condition. And you're going to need a nexus letter that's going to be linking the sleep apnea condition to your in-service event, either directly or secondarily. Now, sleep apnea is a very common condition amongst veterans, especially veterans who have served in the Gulf Wars. So just to reinforce, if you think you have sleep apnea or you are diagnosed with sleep apnea and you feel like it's related to your time in the service, don't delay because changes are coming. So if you found today's video to be of value, please take a second, subscribe to my channel, put a like on the video to send the content out to more veterans, and I appreciate you watching. I'm Mike, and I'll see you on the next episode.